Zakir Hussain will now deliver the second lecture of the series. Dr. Zakir Hussain.
Mr. Ramadhyani, ladies and gentlemen, I might be pardoned for starting this talk with two presumptions which betray incurable optimism and wishful thinking. The first of it is that I assume that some of you are risking listening to the second lecture after having listened to the first. My optimism seeks to compete with your tenacity and forbearance. The second, and perhaps even more drastic presumption, is that you would recollect what I was saying last time. I might help you to recall that after having placed before you what I thought education was, I had begun to deal with certain considerations which to me appeared to flow out, as it were, from that concept of education. I had dealt with the three important principles of individuality, of the stage of development of that individuality, and of the indivisible totality which education seeks to form. I had just mentioned the principle of activity, and I propose to begin my talk today with the discussion and elucidation of that principle. In a sense, no school in any age has been without some self-activity by the pupils. Even the most cruel drilling in reading, writing, and arithmetic, and the most passive storing in memory of lumps of information is stuffed into one's head by others' grace, had to be accompanied by some self-activity. But it was at best an accidental accompaniment of something that they did not aim at or consider of much educational importance. The positive introduction of the principle as an integral part of educational thinking and practice has been due to the great Swiss educator Pestalozzi. It has received almost universal recognition. But as you would surely know from daily experience, the acceptance of a principle is quite frequently the worst thing that can happen to it. Enthusiastic supporters make the letter kill the spirit. Clever skeptics, led to acceptance by ulterior considerations, know how to transform it beyond recognition. It is to them the easiest way to sabotage it. Keep the name and let the substance alone is their secret parole. It has happened to many a good principle in our own country. Anyway, this principle of self-activity came into European and American schools in the last century. Although the activity was usually kept within reasonably modest proportions in relation to the main business, passive receptivity, which was the school's sheet anchor. Even this modest dose was actively imposed from outside. It was not generally recognized that the child, the educand, had an innate urge to understand, to grasp, to do, to accomplish, an urge spontaneously to keep himself engaged in ways prescribed by his own mental makeup. It has been and it still is too difficult for the school to concede that education is not a stamping or dressing from the outside, and that all true education is really self-education. But this was what Pestalozzi had really in view. In fact, one of his eminent biographers, Paul Natorp, himself a thinker of eminence, has called his activity principle the principle of spontaneity. Latterly, however, a reaction has been noticeable and the basically healthy tendency to go from the book school to the work school or to the school community has even tended to manifest unwise exaggerations. While I have, for instance, seen basic schools supposed to have craft work as the center of their activity, where there is no semblance of work in any sense of the word, I have also met basic school teachers who told me in all earnestness and with some degree of pride that they did not allow any books in their school, for verily it was a school of activity and work. I trust you will sympathize with me when I confess that I did not think it wise to inquire what kind of work. I have known an eminent German educationist during the period of the great experimentation in education after the First World War say of his school that my girls do everything. The teachers are nowhere in the picture. I demand spontaneous self-activity at all stages in education, in the determination of objectives, in the organization of work, in the supervision of the processes of work, in all questions where any decisions are called for, in the corrections that are required, in the evaluation of the process and its result. I give them freedom in everything. Now, my own feeling is that in these rather heroic moods of exaggeration, one is inclined to forget that the way to real freedom goes over a good deal of the terrain of directed effort. A school totally without direction and authority may prove to be a foolish and, what might be worse, a fruitless venture. No, there is no road to education that spins round and round the self in spite of all the spontaneity in the world. There is none from the potential to the realized human personality that does not pass through society and its goods of culture. Only in gradual and judiciously selective contact with these, and in the activity engendered in assimilating them, is the individual mind awakened and enabled to discover the law of its being. The nursing and fostering of the creative and the spontaneous in the child has to go hand in hand with breeding and discipline that past achievements and examples afford. Ladies and gentlemen, it occurs to me at this point that I was rather hasty in proceeding to indicate the misunderstanding and exaggeration to which the concept of spontaneous activity might be liable. I should have first made clear what I understand under the term as an educative device. 4 kinds of activity suggest themselves to me: the play activity, the sport activity, the casual occupational activity, and work activity. Play is an activity which is its own end. It has none outside itself. It's play for the sake of play. It does not aim at producing anything outside the child or any quality in the child. It is its own reward. Even when it grows beyond the stage of illusion play and seems to have some sort of a vague aim, that aim is not to be objectively realized. The imagination of the playing child is not subject to the laws of the object. It can make anything serve as anything. A stick as a horse, a piece of paper as a flower, another piece as a vase, itself as the teacher, the mother as the pupil, and a matchstick as the teacher's rod. And it works, the child is happy. Sport, on the other hand, is an activity with an objective. The objective of increased efficiency and facility in certain movements and actions. But sport also does not seek to produce anything outside itself. Its aim is inherent in it and is signified by the championship or the record as indications of superior efficiency. If sport is engaged in for other objects, as for instance for earning money, it becomes a profession. Or if for health, it is no longer sport but physical exercise. As against these two, the other two forms of activity, casual occupation and work, have distinctly, definitely objectives outside themselves to realize. They are never ends in themselves. They aim at the concrete, objective realization of some idea. Casual occupations and hobbies have their motive in the result of the concretization as well as in the activity involved. It is not too much or too seriously concerned with the perfect and complete attainment of the aimed at result. It stops when the pleasurableness of the activity ceases, or as soon as the work is about complete in some form or the other. Activity that originates in play and stops at mere casual occupation is the fertile breeding ground of the dilettante. The chief purpose of the educative process is to lead it on to the fourth form of activity, namely work. I am afraid I shall have to detain you a while with the characterization of work as one of the most important, if not the only instrument of education. Even the most important instrument might sound to you to betray an exaggerated emphasis. But I hope it will help to forestall and prevent the suspicion that I could indiscriminately regard all work as educative. Work, hard, strenuous physical work, is the fate of the overwhelming majority of our people. And yet, unfortunately, one could not claim that they were all well educated. Although indeed, some without acquiring that rather deceitful skill of literacy are better educated than most of our so-called educated.
This is All India Radio Archives recording.
Yes, all work is not educative, although educative work is the greatest source of real education. This rather paradoxical remark demands that I should elucidate as to what I mean by educative work. Work, that is, that helps in the cultivation of the mind and the shaping of character and personality. The first thing we should clearly understand in this connection is that manual physical work, accompanied howsoever much by eagerness and interest and exertion, cannot be educative if it does not issue forth from a preparatory mental activity as an essential first conclusive step in that work. It is this essential ingredient of some manual work which helps to make it educative. As the manual activity progresses, the first conclusive intellectual step may be subjected to revision and refinement or change, but it must precede all educative manual work. Purely mechanical work, isolated from the rest of the worker's mental life, can never be educative. Nor is sheer imitation educative, unless it is at least preceded by a comprehension and understanding of what has to be imitated. Work that is educative has normally 4 stages. The clear consciousness of the problem, what exactly is to be done. Secondly, the formation of a plan of work, the choice of appropriate means, thinking out the various steps in which it has to be accomplished. Thirdly, the actual execution of the work. And fourthly, self-criticism of the result of the work done in the light of number 1, namely what exactly was to be done. These have been called the 4 steps of objectification. In manual work of an educative nature, only the 3rd step, the actual execution of the work, is manual. The other 3 consist mainly of mental exertion. In the case of work that is not manual, all the 4 steps consist principally of mental activity. this mental activity, which may accompany a piece of manual work or the resolving of a moral situation by a definite choice, or the solving of a theoretical problem, has a distinct value in training the mind to tackle similar problems more easily and with greater confidence when they occur later. They engender a skill in and a development of the process of logical thinking. Although not the whole of education, this is a great step forward towards it. For the processes of thinking may not be allowed to stay at the level at which they manifest themselves in early childhood. The child as a child already begins to bring some kind of an order in the ever-growing mass of its experience. Long before he can speak and avail himself of word symbols for things and concepts, the processes of comparison, differentiation, and identification begin to operate. As soon as he becomes conscious of the ends of his spontaneous activity and becomes aware of the difference between ends and means, he begins not only to feel the need of establishing valid end-means relationships, but also starts seeking to establish the relationship of cause and effect, reality and appearance, whole and part, and similar categorical relationships. Whether these empirically established relationships are true, whether the symbols indicating the concepts involved are unequivocal, and other considerations of that nature do not yet torment the child. His almost incessant volley of questions about what and where, why and wherefore is temporarily stilled by even the most superficial answer. He only insists on having an answer, for that establishes for him the categorical and logical relationship he is seeking. The child attempts to form judgments and combines them in regular conclusions without caring to test if the conclusions are valid and justified. His is a kind of logical thinking without proper discipline, without having worked to make the process more reliable and trustworthy. In contrast to this, there is the logical process used in mathematics and formal logic. Here thinking deals with propositions which follow necessarily from unequivocal premises, these being either evident or previously proved to be true. Both proceed from evident axioms and operate with unambiguous concepts, with unequivocal symbols to represent these, and the mind does not borrow its concepts from reality, but produces them from within itself in mathematics and formal logic. But there is an endless variety of reality facing man which he does not produce from within his mind and which he gradually experiences in his actions and dealings. To make this outside reality serviceable to him, he must probe into it. For this, he needs an apparatus of logical thinking which involves, besides the formation of categorical relationships, also the making of valid analytic and synthetic judgments. He needs the habit of objective reflection, which implies careful training. The naive and easily satisfied logical process of the child have to help to develop into a careful, self-critical and methodical process. For habits of thought will be formed in any case. If habits of careful insight are not developed, then habits of impetuous, superficial, and hasty thinking will form. If the habits of suspending judgment in order to test its truth is not ingrained, habits of gullible credulity or suspicious incredulousness will form. To ensure the qualities of care, constancy, and thoroughness in thinking, it is necessary to provide opportunities of practicing them. The conditions for the exercise of this mental activity can be and are neglected by the intellectual book schools as well as by the practical work schools. And any school, whatever emphases are reflected in its program of work, will not be a place of
All India
education.
Radio Archives
I say
records.
will not be a place of education unless it provides ample opportunity for this kind of activity, this kind of work. Schools that see their functions of imparting information and developing skills can, as they much too often, if not invariably do, neglect to provide this essential mental work as their chief concern. I might shock some of you connected with educational institutions by putting forth more directly the proposition I have already enunciated before, that information and skill are not synonymous with education. I will take that risk, for I mean what I have said. Indeed, information and skill are not even reliable measures of education. In order to make them serviceable as such, we must make a distinction. Information, as you can easily see, can be of two kinds. It can be knowledge acquired by someone else by his own mental effort and passed on to us as ready-made information. Or it can be knowledge acquired by us through our own experience, knowledge that has grown in our mind by its own efforts. Similarly, skill can be of two varieties. It can be mechanical skill, attained by imitative diligence, capable of repeating existing values, or it can be a non-mechanical skill based on natural disposition, creating new values. The first kind of information and skill is addition from the outside.
This is
The second kind of knowledge and skill, an enrichment and transformation from within. The first represents an external appendage. The second signifies an internal development. The first is instruction. The second is education. The first is superficial polish. The second is essential culture. The difference between schools serving the first and those serving the second consists mainly in the convenient absence or the deliberate provision of opportunities for the kind of mental work which, when spontaneously undertaken, develops habits of careful and thorough thinking. You would remember that when I began the discussion of this fourth principle of education, namely spontaneous activity, I referred to some exaggerations to which the idea is liable. One of these exaggerations demands spontaneous activity to be the only kind of activity in the good school, and attempts to taboo traditional knowledge and mechanical skill. This, I think, is a thoroughly mistaken exaggeration and ignores the fact that every child is born in a society with a culture. The purposes of spontaneous, self-willed work do grip, as it were, one's whole being and themselves supply the urge to acquire a good deal of traditional knowledge and a good deal of mechanical skill if the progress in the pursuit of the spontaneous purposes is not to be disconcertingly slow. Traditional knowledge and mechanical skill will therefore always have a place in educational work, but only when they come in to fill the gaps of knowledge acquired or sought to be acquired by direct experience, or of a skill attained or sought to be attained through creative work. Educative work has to be constantly reinforced by traditional knowledge and mechanical skill. I wish, ladies and gentlemen, to raise with you at this stage an important and inevitable question about the educative value of work as I have attempted to describe it. The most that I have claimed for it, and it is not a small claim, is the opportunity it affords of mental activity which alone can help to form in the educand the utterly necessary habits of careful, consequent, logical thinking. This is a formal training of some functions of the mind. It produces a mental, intellectual skill. Can work that produces this result, however important the result, be called educative in the true sense? I am afraid I cannot answer with a yes to this question. Skills and qualities can be recognized as fruits of true education only if they are acquired and can therefore be used in the service of objective values. All the skilled habits of consequent, flawless, logical thinking can be in the possession of someone who has never been gripped by anything outside himself, in the possession of a person who may never have come out of his narrow shell, never been possessed of a great idea, never been fired by a noble cause, never been ennobled by love. It may be in the possession of someone who can make it effectively to subserve even antisocial criminal purposes. The characteristic mark of an educated man should be a positive attitude towards goods of culture, that is, towards ultimate objective values. That attitude should be the cherished product of educational and instructional activity. Gershon Steiner, with whose name you are now familiar, has in his illuminating study Begriff der Arbeitsschule rightly observed that a truly educated man displays 5 unmistakable signs. I give them here not in translation but in a free paraphrase with the negative tail end tucked on by me. The educated man, number 1, he says, the educated man has a certain breadth of intellectual horizon with reference to values attached to things and persons. He has no blinkers. Number 2, he possesses a certain degree of lively open-mindedness and accessibility to new values and ideas. He is no Philistine. Number 3, he has an inner urge towards moral growth and constantly presses towards perfection in his own person or in the world around him. He is not conceited and never imagines he has reached the destination. Number 4, he has a flexible and versatile connection with value relationships among things as against the rigorous stiffness of the zealot or the bureaucrat. He is not a hard-boiled egg. Number 5, his value estimations, having been organized around an absolute objective value, he gives clear evidence of a central psychic focus which irradiates all his action, thought, and feeling. He is no internally dissipated busybody. Gershon Steiner has summed up these qualities in a rather terse definition of education as an individually organized sense of values, awakened by the goods of culture. The chief emphasis is, as you would see, on the goods of culture, for it is in them that these objective values are incorporated and kept stored. It is through them that the growing mind can experience these values, and the latent energy stored in goods of culture is transformed into kinetic energy in the subjective mind. Acceptance of and allegiance to these values is objectivity, the readiness to subordinate the subjective to the valid objective value. To say it briefly, all work of the hand or of the mind in which the worker seeks to be objective is educative work. Objectivity, it has been aptly said, is morality. For what else is ethical behavior but readiness to prefer the objective norms to the subjective inclination and interest. Objectivity aims only at the perfect realization of values. Objectivity is impartial. Objectivity is impersonal. But how does one come to this objective attitude in one's activity? How is one put on the road to true education? You would perhaps remember that we had at an earlier stage in this discussion distinguished four forms of activity: play, sport, casual occupation, and earnest work. In all of them, the actor experiences positive or negative values of some kind or the other. All of them tend to develop some function or the other in the actor. But if you had in mind the characterization of these four forms of activity, you will agree with me that of all of them, it is only work that can in certain circumstances have educative value. For it is only in earnest work that the worker aims not at just any result, but at as perfect an attainment as possible of the result aimed at. Unfinished, careless, slipshod work, whatever else it might be, is surely not educative. Perfect attainment, I said, and perfection is itself one of the highest formal values. Some work is more suited to bring gradually the experience of this value of perfection than some other work. It is easier in the case of work whose results lend themselves easily to effective self-criticism by the worker. Technical work, for instance, enjoys this advantage in a very extraordinary degree. A school that seeks to make work educative can never do too much to provide the most ample opportunities to its pupils of the joyful and stimulating experience of the value of perfection, of bringing something, some task, however small, as near to perfection as possible, and not leaving it till that has happened. The urge towards perfection will be initiated in many a case by egocentric and not objective motives. But the experience of achieving something like perfection will, by frequent repetition, most likely succeed in transforming this motive also. The moment this happens, the urge to penetrate into the nature of every means conducive to the attainment of the perfect results becomes almost irresistible. These means consist usually of a variety of the goods of culture. A technical device may be, or a foreign language, or a certain branch of science, or studies in the biography of certain persons, or the works of a poet, and so on. The pupil, by his urge to master these means, gets into close touch with them. He experiences the values now which these goods embody, the values that correspond to his own mental configuration, awaken, as it were, the corresponding regions of his mind to activity and lead him to the enterprise of realizing some of these values also in his work, and again to bring them as near to perfection as he might. For as we know from our earlier discussion, it is one of the essential qualities of the absolute values that they create an urge for realization and for perfection. Engaged in this exhilarating experience, the original subjective egocentric motivation gets submerged under an unqualified commitment to the various values and to the formal value of perfection with reference to them. I am afraid I have taken a little too long over this fourth principle that seemed to me to flow out of the concept of education which I have stated. But the feeling has been growing on me that we who now for quite 2 decades have been flirting with the idea of the work school as the base of our national educational edifice owe it to ourselves to think out this particular aspect of education a little more closely to be able to avoid woolly notions and vague concepts leading to ineffective work, and to be able to deal with the problem with a little more of constancy in thinking and practice. We may, if we give the matter the earnest thought it deserves, agree with the statement with which I started today's discussion, namely that work was the most important instrument of education. That the educative in work, even manual work, is the mental activity involved, which may not be neglected except at the peril of depriving work of all educative quality. That work is educative, for it can be used to develop habits of careful, methodical thinking. That it is educative if it's objective and if it is actuated by the urge to perform it to possible perfection. That its educative function is greatly enhanced by the opportunity of the self-criticism of the result of work, an opportunity which finds its easiest, although by no means its only fulfillment in manual and technical
All India
work.
Radio Archives recording.
I might now briefly state and elucidate two other principles which are valid for all education. You would remember that I am dealing with considerations that are valid for all education, and would go in my third lecture to what I say should be done in connection with education for all. The first of these is the social concern of education. The principles we have so far discussed have kept mainly the individual in view, without anything like a full recognition of the individual's relationship to society. It is no doubt true that by assuring that the mental and moral development of the individual mind was to be produced by its association with and assimilation of the cultural goods of the society in which he is placed, we had established a silver link, a silken tie between him and his society. But the emphasis so far has nevertheless been on the development of the individual mind and the growth of a free moral personality. The principle which we are now considering postulates as an objective of education the steadily growing approach of society to a better and juster and more graceful way of life. The individual mind, we must readily admit, cannot grow to its fullest possibility without a corresponding advance of the collective social existence. One who aims at excellence in the individual must almost inevitably aim at it and look for it in society. No less a seer than Plato had to examine the whole framework and development of society
This
in his
is
search
All
for
India
individual
Radio
virtue.
Archives recording.
The storehouse of society, in which it keeps, among other uses for the educative use of its members, the goods of culture created by past human endeavor, depends for its replenishment and its growth on the readiness of its members to protect it, cherish it, cleanse it of decaying and decrepit material, and provide fresher and richer acquisitions for it. If the individual were to confine himself to his own mental, moral, and spiritual growth, and to engage in raising the edifice of culture in his own individual being, and chose to be indifferent to what happens to society, to how far and how effectively the absolute values are realized in social organization, he might well succeed in perfecting his own spiritual being. But if his example were to be generally accepted, all roads to the culture and education, even of the individual, will become dark and dreary lanes to a wasteland, and the self-centered, highly spiritual, morally free and autonomous personality will perhaps have to perch high and dry on some rock in the wasteland, contemplating nothing more great than the tip of his nose. Opportunities of such isolated but barren moral eminence are available in most societies, even in democratic societies. For societies that are not too hard up can afford the luxury of tolerating or even encouraging and supporting isolated specimens of such sterile excellence. For they perhaps realize
Radio
that
archives
even such an
recording.
isolated good life may, by sheer being there, serve as an educative force. But they can do so only in exceptional and very few cases. This is possible for more numerous, although even here rather small groups in societies that are distinctly and expressly exploitative in nature, and in which the leisured few can allow themselves all sorts of aristocratic self-sufficiencies at the expense of the toiling many. But in a democratic society, it is essential that the individual who is obliged for his nourishment in body, mind, and soul to the cooperation of fellow citizens should cheerfully share the responsibility of making the life of society a better life, both morally and materially. The allegiance to higher values has to be given not only in individual life, society too has to be helped to own allegiance to them in its organized social existence. And among the potent goods of culture, which when experienced and accepted make possible an individually organized system of values, a good and just society, a clean political life, and an honest leadership devoted transparently to the general good are themselves forces of the highest educative value. This principle of individual and social mutuality is seldom kept in view in the organization of our education. Schools and other institutions of instruction are so utterly engrossed in their enterprise of so-called intellectual advancement that they seem to have no time for such, to them, trivial considerations.
This is
In order to
the
educate
radio
for social
archives recording.
responsibility, these institutions should themselves be organized units of community living. One learns to swim by swimming in water. One learns to serve by serving in society. Unless this principle becomes the life breath of our educational institutions, all other reform will be just patchwork. For how else will the moral value of a sound social organization be experienced except by living as a member of such an organization? One may hold forth on the virtues of a sound social life. One may go all out to clarify its theoretical foundations. One may teach all the history that there is and all the civics one might improvise. But one cannot hope to enable the student to experience the life-giving and energizing quality of being the member of a good and just society with anything like the vividness which is required to awaken the urgent moral challenge of serving it in order to preserve its present excellence and to improve its future quality. Experienced in a good home, in a good school community, in a social group of like-minded persons, it can become a lifelong commitment for the service of the town, the state, the nation, and even mankind. School communities based on common values and common cultural goods, like the public schools of England, a fair number of experimental schools, and school communities in Europe, the USA, and Palestine, and the plan to establish a very considerable number of such communities in the Soviet republics in the near future, are indications of progressive educational thinking in diverse environments and naturally with different values and objectives in view. Feeble indications indeed, like a still small voice claiming feebly to be heard in the din of the millions of instructional factories. But the view seems all the same to be gaining ground that real experience of social living in a school community is essential for education in social responsibility and for using it even as a means of social betterment. It may be crying for the moon to wish to have residential school communities for all children anywhere, but I trust human ingenuity to devise ways and means for organizing its schools as communities of work and shared objectives without necessarily having to make them boarding schools. I seem to feel that this will happen first, and that perhaps soon, in the totalitarian countries. And as in many other things, the democracies will realize a little later what they have missed and what may be even more urgently needed for the preservation of their way of life than for the others. The others can enforce service to the whole. Democracies have to wait on the natural awakening of the sense of social responsibility and the urge to be instrumental in making a better society by providing for the actual energizing experience of the mutually created relationship of individual and society.
All India Radio Archives recording.
It can do so unsystematically in its families, which its industrial developments are rapidly undermining, and it can do so systematically in school communities we should set out to establish with a sense of urgency that can come from the clear recognition of the fact that its future as a way of life is being made or marred in its schools. Now, towards the end of today's talk, I would like to place before you for consideration a last question which the nature of education, as we have sought to envisage it, makes it imperative to clarify. That is the question of freedom and authority in education. It assumes added importance in a democratic society which, if it is true to itself, respects individuality, considers the human person to be an end and not merely a means, and seeks to educate the individual mind by the nursing and development of its specific values, ends, interest system through the agency of the goods of culture to the goal of a morally free personality. The stress on individuality and the exclusive recognition of the possibility of the individual's development only on the basis of his specific life form would seem to indicate that throughout the organization of education in a democracy, unchecked freedom shall prevail to the entire exclusion of authority. Such a notion is not only a theoretical conjecture, it has been seriously advocated as a view of education as providing opportunities for full growth and the removal of hampering influences, as for instance by Bertrand Russell. A whole educational philosophy of wachsen lassen or let grow has grown. Since we in this sheltered country of ours are not very much addicted to systematic thinking out of our problems, for the reassuring remembrance of the unforgettable fact that our ancestors had thought and meditated, and the complacent consciousness that even now someone somewhere undertakes that tiring labor for us, gives us a blissful feeling of comfortable coziness. And we are not particularly tormented by the consideration of fundamental problems, especially in the field of education. It may seem that this discussion has no reality for us. I am afraid I don't agree with that escapist view. We will have to come to grips with the problem sooner or later, sooner indeed than later. The conflict is on, and nothing but a proper understanding of its nature will help to solve it. The long traditions of intellectual authority, uncritical acceptance, unquestioning conformity, reinforced, if anything, by the prevailing concepts of education as the imparting and acquiring of ready-made information, symbolized in the almost religious attachment to the scriptures known as examination notes, and training in mechanically acquired skills, and the widely prevalent fear of spoiling the child by sparing the rod, and the overpowering urge to save him by its fulsome use, all these seem to imply that authority is the basic principle pervading our educational activity to the exclusion of freedom. There is, however, the other side of the medal too. The license that students are allowing themselves in what they do and what they leave undone, the uncontrolled obsessions, distractions, and dissipations of which they give frequent evidence in their behavior, viewed against the pathetic apathy, indifference, or complacency of the teachers, the angry young men and even the angrier younger ones of the school, on the one hand, the unconcerned, blissfully detached, or dejected and defeated teachers, when they themselves are not classified as the angry young men, on the other, all seem to indicate that in this free land of ours, education subscribes much too totally to the principle of Vox and Lassen, or letting grow. Well, if we cannot let them grow to bring forth flower and fruit, just let them grow into weeds. In this confused situation, we may not hope to organize any fruitful system of national education. I can here only briefly state my view on the matter. Freedom and authority in education are, in my view, no contrasting opposites. For there is no authority in education without the inner freedom which recognizes it. And there is no freedom without regulation and orderliness which is felt as authoritative. If authority signified forced compulsion and freedom stood for just license and arbitrariness, they would indeed be contrasting opposites. But there is no community, be it a family, a school, a state, which, however much it prized freedom, had no rules and regulations that were recognized by constituent members as binding and therefore authoritative. There is no autonomous personality conceivable without principles which could keep the animal instincts and urges in check to enable the human mind to go about its higher business in freedom. Without such regulative principles, society would be a chaotic jumble, personality a slave to animal desires and appetites. A person left to himself from childhood without direction may conceivably come to such regulative principles on his own. The universalities of the laws of the mind do not perhaps quite exclude that possibility. But he will come to them by a very, very long and a very, very hard road. Indeed, and there might not be enough time left for him to put the discovery to much use. The individual is helped by society to go through a stage of outside authority before it reaches that of true self-determination. The road to freedom is made by authority. To cut out authority altogether would be to cut out that road. The real question that concerns education is really not one of either or. It is the problem of determining how long external guidance and authority is essential to reach the agreed end of self-determination. How long might authority last? How soon shall freedom take over? For take over it must, if the development of a moral free personality is the end. There is an authority at the beginning of education and an authority at the end. The authority at the beginning is the authority of age and experience, of affectionate guiding and sympathetic guidance, unfortunately with some possible unpalatable sanctions attached to superior strength, which a good school does everything to keep in the background. At the end is the authority of values freely experienced and freely accepted in the personal and impersonal goods of culture, a general acceptance at a fairly early stage of the need of orderly and smooth working of the educational activity, and of the need of subordination and integration in the educational organization should not be difficult to achieve, provided the matter is not left to chance. An insight into and a reverence for the values education stands for and the values the teachers might represent may appear difficult to engender. But till that has been done, one should at least know that education is not happening. The business and the privilege of the educator and of the school or college as an educated community is to guide and help and direct the young in their charge in such a way as to develop in them a sense of responsibility for their actions, their omissions, and to awaken in them an irrepressible urge towards self-education, and to the extent they succeed in these, to give them the fullest measure of freedom and self-determination commensurate with such success. Easily said, but hard work for generations of good teachers. I hope and trust they will be forthcoming. Thank you.